Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, and welcome to the final session of the IPI Global Network Virtual World Congress. Today, we are looking at journalism on the cutting edge, building media credibility and trust in Africa. Our panelists for today are SiSAY, publisher of the Ethiopian Business Review, Allison, the African editor of South Africa's Mail and Guardian. And we hope that a little bit later from Zambia, Joan Chirwa, the founder of the Free Press Initiative, will be able to join us. Unfortunately, she had a last minute family emergency, but she said she will do everything possible to join the panel as soon as possible. There is so much that should excite us about journalism in Africa. And here is Christoph Plate from our partner organization, the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, to Konrad Adenauer Stiftung in Africa, to take you through today's discussion. Christoph, on to you, and all the best.
Thank you very much, Barbara, and good afternoon from Johannesburg in South Africa. As Barbara mentioned, I'm the director of CAS Media Africa. That's the media program for Sub-Sahara Africa of the German Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. And in collaboration with the International Press Institute in Vienna, I'm happy to welcome you all to our discussion on media credibility and trust in media on the African continent. In Europe, but also in Africa, we have had experiences of journalists not doing their job properly, with some following their political agenda, others taking bribes or making up stories. The Sunday Times here in South Africa happily took manipulated evidence because it fitted their political beliefs. Or the German magazine Der Spiegel had a reporter on its payroll who told fairy tales and called them journalism and collected journalism awards for it. In many African countries, it was the media, the printed press in the 1990s that helped democratization, or helped here in South Africa to bring down apartheid. But we are far from the quality, I would assume, that we had in the 1990s. Partly this has to do with economics, partly it has to do with journalists who have not understood that if they are activists, they cannot be good journalists, and vice versa. Activism and journalism in one person does a lot of damage to serious media. Thanks to the pandemic, many media consumers on the African continent seem to realize the importance of a free press, of verified news, of media work that is being properly financed. I would say that more people now than 9 months ago acknowledge that we need a press that says how it is, that investigates the powers that be and their opponents alike. Maybe the general suspicion against parts of the media has shrunk, but the connection between credibility and economics persists even stronger. In the next hour, we want to discuss with you, the spectators, with you, the attendees also, and with 3 media personalities from the African continent, how media can maintain and sustain trust and credibility. We will incorporate your questions and comments in the Q&A section. And as Barbara Triumphi already mentioned, Joan Chirwa from Lusaka in Zambia will hopefully join us later. Then I'm happy to have with us Amanyehun SiSAY, publisher in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. Welcome, Aman. And I'm happy to welcome South African journalist Allison here in Johannesburg. Welcome, Simon. All these 3 media personalities stand for innovative approaches in media production under very difficult, if not differing circumstances. And I would like to start by asking Amanyehun SiSAY in Addis Ababa. You are the publisher of the Ethiopian Business Review, Aman, as well as the Amharic weekly Addis Maleda. Yet Ethiopia has for decades, under various dictatorships, always had a press that was controlled and that was applauding those ones in power. And then we had an exiled press that was hammering those ones in power. So for you as a publisher, how difficult is it to create a sentiment in Ethiopia that there's media that can actually be trusted and that is non-partisan? Aman? You have to unmute yourself, please.
Chris and the IPI for inviting me to this workshop. It's really a pleasure and a nice introduction, a very generous introduction, Chris. Yes, it is a very challenging operating environment that we have had in Ethiopia. You know, the country is very well known for this less friendly operating environment for media, civil society organizations, for political parties, for private businesses. Operating in such an environment is, of course, very challenging, very tough, but we always have to rise above our challenges and hope in one hand that a better day will come, and also try to work today what we have to do to shape that better future in mind. We have a very different context compared to many countries, even by African standards. We have in one hand an industry which is not very well supported to flourish. So media as an industry, media as a business is never an encouraged sort of investment or business arena, and journalism as a profession is also not very much appreciated, supported, or encouraged to flourish in the country. So operating within this context, especially in a kind of situation where we have a very authoritarian regimes quite for a number of years in our history. We have only government institutions that trains journalists in the country. They train and flood the industry with poorly educated graduates. And we have media institutions that have also political interests. And our media landscape, which is an extension of the political situation in the country, we have two narratives. One, a pro-Ethiopianist political views, and media subscribing to this ideology also present content that are shaped by this political interest. And we also have other medias which subscribe to another political thought in the country, which is based on ethnic narration of the Ethiopian political activities. So we have also other medias which subscribe to this idea, and their content is usually based on their political interest. And many private media organizations really struggle even to ensure their survival, because getting advertisers and is very challenging, because government will somehow put various kinds of pressure if they put in this kind of media products that subscribe to this idea of a pan-Ethiopianist perspective. Government will somehow put a pressure on companies that advertise in such medias that the business organization is ideology. The same thing with the other perspectives. So we don't have a media landscape where real issues are really discussed by mainstream medias. Because one way or another, the political system neither creates the environments where advertisement, subscription, and all other issues that are really very important for media companies to survive are compromised. They fear the government. So the private media that we have, they cover a substantial proportion of their coverage: sport, entertainment, art. So the real issues are not discussed. So in one hand, we have media institutions that have survival issues, and on the other hand, we have media institutions where we don't see gray-haired journalists. The journalists, they come, they try to learn and acquire basic skills, and 2 years later or 3 years later, perhaps they leave and join another industry. They become communication officers, public relation officers in international organizations, in business organizations, or even in government institutions. So we have fresh graduates training young people. If I take the experience of my own company where I work, we have, I mean, the average is below 30. It tells you how young the newsroom is. We don't have journalists who have 2 decades or even 1 decade of experience. So we always have young people who have to learn, and the moment they acquire basic skills and improve their writing or communication skills, they leave. So we have a situation where mainstream media suffer from constant staff turnover and also poor financial situations. And we also have very poor journalism schools, 100% owned by government. There are 13 universities that teach journalism. All of them are government owned. And these government owned universities fled the industry with poorly educated graduates. So it's really very difficult because when real issues are very well discussed in these medias, one thing for lack of capacity, because the journalists are not very well educated, there will be content problem. And on the other hand, the medias have financial problems, so be it in terms of acquiring the technology they need to pursue their activities, they have a challenge. And we have laws, the anti-terrorism law, which stifles the good operating environment in the media, and many people really don't want to stay in the media industry. But people have interest to learn about politics, so real political issues are discussed in the social media, where people hide their identity and even location, and hate speech, extreme narrations on certain political ideologies are highly circulating in the environment. So we really have a very serious kind of...
Can I quickly ask you in between, because you are publishing an English-speaking magazine that addresses business leaders, politicians, I would say, representatives of corporate industry, and then you have a weekly paper in Amharic, the lingua franca in Ethiopia. Because we are in this conversation, we are mostly talking about trust, also, of course, about economics, but about trust in media. Do you find it easier to gain trust by the media consumer, from the media consumer, if you publish in a vernacular language, in a lingua franca like Amharic, than in English?
Well, the issue of credibility is, of course, very important, and the facts that we publish now in Amharic, it broadens the audience. It broadens the audience and the distribution of the publication, both in print and digital. But the English content that we publish, Ethiopian Business Review, one thing it focuses on business and economic issues, so the audience is a bit targeted. And the fact that it's published in English further narrows the readership. So the Amharic content at this Maleda is very well privileged, because Amharic is widely spoken in the country, and that broadens. So the issue of credibility, of course, one challenge of journalists is producing good content that is balanced, that is objective and fairly reported, is language. The language itself is a barrier. So when we write in Amharic, they are better to understand the issue and report it fairly. So we have an opportunity of a wider readership because we write in Amharic.
Thanks very much, Aman. We'll come to that language and training topic that you raised later on in our discussion. But over to you first, Simon Allison in Johannesburg in South Africa. You are the Africa editor of the Weekly Mail and Guardian, and since a couple of months, you are also the editor of the first WhatsApp newspaper on the continent called The Continent, that is being distributed free of charge by WhatsApp. That's a very innovative step, I would say. but the press in South Africa, I mentioned it earlier on, had really its heydays and its glorious days, I think, in the late 1980s and early 1990s. And it has gone through ups and downs. I mentioned the scandal around the Sunday Times, where journalists just took doctored evidence that fitted into their political beliefs. Yet again, there was also a case where so-called Gupta leaks were published that saw a president resigning because of wrongdoings that were leaked to the press. Has this resignation of President Jacob Zuma and of the Gupta leaks done the image and the credibility of the press in South Africa a good service?
You know, that's a very difficult question to answer. The press is, you know, we have this tendency of speaking about the press like it is one kind of entity, one thing. You know, the same way that people speak about Africa as a country, we tend to speak about the press as a unified force. And I think in South Africa, what we have seen is that the press is a very divided entity. And, you know, you have the state-run press, you have various different independent newspapers owned by various different people who appeal to various different constituencies. And what has become apparent in the last few years is that those divisions are becoming more and more pronounced. So a lot of the conversation that you see on social media these days, you know, a website like the Daily Maverick might publish a big investigation, and there'll immediately be a section of social media that responds while saying, oh no, that's, you know, white monopoly capitalist and we don't trust it, even before they've read the investigation. And so it's a much more polarized space where people sort of pick media outlets almost like they pick football teams and support them or choose not to support them. That being said, I think the COVID-19 pandemic, while it has had a very devastating impact on the finances of media houses, has also played a key role in helping to restore public trust in the job that journalists do. We had quite extraordinary statistics over the months of February, March, April, May, while South Africa was in the height of the first wave of the pandemic. The numbers of people that we were seeing coming to our website to look for credible, reliable news was extraordinary. It was more than we've ever seen in our history. And what that showed us is that when times are tough, when people are getting desperate for reliable information, they turn to places that they know they can trust. And the Mail and Guardian, with its long pedigree in South Africa, I think is one of those places. And that for us was comforting because it showed us that there is a much higher degree of media literacy in the country than we normally give it credit for. And that people are becoming more and more aware of the need for independent journalism. Our mission now is to try and translate that into a sustainable revenue generation model. Of course, that's not just the Mail and Guardian's challenge, it's every independent newspaper and media house's challenge. But I think that audiences are increasingly realizing that, hey, this journalism thing is actually really important. And of course, the Gupta leaks were a major part of that. This was a story that effectively brought down the president of South Africa. It was quite extraordinary, and it was a collaboration of several different media houses working with huge amounts of data. And that, more than anything else, I think, was a reminder to people that journalism is powerful. The stuff that journalists do is really powerful. But the flip side of that, of course, is with great power comes great responsibility. And that's where we have to work as journalists, both in keeping our industry honest, in making sure that we all uphold the highest standards possible, but also, and this is very important, in finding new ways to connect with our audiences, to make sure that we are speaking to potential audiences on the platforms and in the places where they are, and making sure our journalism evolves along with our audiences. And for too long, we haven't been doing that in South Africa. And that has been something that's been letting us down.
Thanks very much for this. I was going to ask both of you, maybe we start with Aman, this notion that Simon brought into the discussion, that the accusation that the media is not really listening to its audience, that this is being substantiated on an almost daily basis. I mean, when I listen to the news here in South Africa, or when I listen to the news elsewhere, or when I read papers, I very often, and this also applies, by the way, to many news outlets in Europe, I very often have this feeling that there's the journalist or the editor in his ivory tower, and when has he last sat in a pub or driven on a public bus and heard what people are talking about? Is that something that Aman and Simon, that you are actively encouraging your writers, your reporters, your journalists, your editors to do, to actually listen and to be in conversation with the audience?
Of course, we encourage our writers to engage with the audience as much as possible. I mean, original reporters usually comes directly by conversing with the audience. So it's really very important. However, there are limitations in our country because the media institutions are not very strong financially or even in human resource. They are not very strong, so we always have limitations, even though we want to do that more often. We have very limited capacity, but it's really very important to improve the credibility of news that we report.
And Simon, I mean, in order to send somebody out to investigate, you also need time and you need funds. Is that something you encourage your colleagues to do?
You know, my father was a journalist as well. And he used to make a point when he hired new journalists that he would not hire journalists from journalism schools. And the reason for this, he said, was that he first had to untrain them before he could train them. And I think that while, of course, we are not so strict these days, we like journalism schools, but there is something in that there is an established way of doing things. At my newspaper, the Mail and Guardian, we like writing long feature stories. So there is a sort of, you know, a feeling that if a story is more than 1,200 words, then it's a very valuable, worthwhile story. And so all the writers are trying to write long, in-depth stories. And of course, we love long, in-depth stories sometimes. But actually, there are many stories that are better done short, sharp, sweet. That's how you reach a wider audience. So we are having to try and untrain ourselves. And at the same time, Christoph, you're absolutely right. We have to be paying more attention to what our audiences are doing and what they are saying. But there is a catch here, because, of course, if you go to our existing audience and say, hey, what do you like? Well, they are our audience. They've been with us for many years. They're probably going to say, well, we like the way you do things. That's why we keep reading you. The trick is to find new audiences and to find new ways of reaching places that you haven't reached before. And that's where I think it requires a lot of bold and innovative thinking within the newsroom. It requires a lot of trial and error. Just, you know, not everything's going to work, but if you can try a few things, maybe one of those things will work. And I'd like to see a lot more of that in newsrooms, both in South Africa and across the continent.
Simon, you mentioned earlier on that when we talk about the press, we shouldn't talk about the press or the media as a monolithic block, just as we don't talk about Africa as a country, as it is very popular in Europe and the US, where Africa is being perceived as a country, which we all know, living on the continent, it is not. Have you thought that in the pandemic, and have you both realized, Aman as well, realized or observed in the pandemic that this media audience that is craving for verified news is more sophisticated or is better aware of separating serious news and good media, let's call it that way, from all the trash that is also out there?
That's a really good question, Christoph. And it's a tricky one. I think that there is a higher degree of media literacy than we give our audiences credit for in general. But what I think, you know, when we think about fake news and how fake news spreads, what is so key to the spread of fake news is, of course, ordinary people who are taking this information and then sharing it, even when they might know that it's not necessarily true. But humans have this desire to share information. And I think that this desire is an incredibly powerful thing. It kind of makes us what we are. It keeps our societies together, the urge to communicate and share information. What we have done a bad job of as journalists is giving people information in a way that they can share it. And WhatsApp is a great example of this. So this is the primary method of digital communication for most of the African continent, is via smartphone, via WhatsApp. And yet, almost no major media houses have any form of presence on this medium. It means that the only people communicating news on WhatsApp are people making fake news. And that to me is a tragedy. And it means that, journalists need to be doing more and thinking about things differently. What we have found with The Continent, which is a WhatsApp-based publication, is that when we have given people the tools, the content in a way that they can share it with their friends and family, they enthusiastically embrace that. And then they're sharing real news instead of fake news. And that's a really powerful thing.
Aman, over to you. Ethiopia is a country that is very prone to fake news, where social media is very, very much alive. And a lot of the ethnic and religious hatred that we hear about from Ethiopia is being played out on social media. How do you deal with that?
We have quite a worrisome spread of fake news every time on social media, and this stems from the weakening mainstream media, as more and more people are not finding a lot of information from the mainstream medias. They go to social medias if they could find helpful information. So people interested on political, religious, and sometimes ethnic issues, they are taking advantage of this lack of strong mainstream media presence. So they use the social media to advance their interests by leaking fake news, hate speech. They don't identify themselves. They hide their locations. It's usually based in North America and Europe, so they spread this. It's really very challenging. But these days, mainstream medias such as ours, we're trying to understand the value and importance of social media. So we open and as much as possible provide more information using Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Twitter, and other social media accounts. I mean, it's a new thing that many mainstream medias are also properly paying attention to the importance of social media. But the more information is reaching the public, to the wider public on all opportunities using the mainstream as well as social medias, the negative impact of hate speech and also unverified information would decline. So government recently reduced the price of internet. I hope that is going to empower many young people to use internet, and media companies such as ours are also capitalizing on that and taking the social media as an important tool of spreading verified information. So it's quite a challenge, and it's also a new experience that we're learning every day.
Coming to some of the questions that I see in the Q&A box, Jackie Park from Australia is asking, what are your methods, Simon and Aman, to listen to your audience or to communicate with your audience? And Anya Schifrin from Columbia University in New York is asking, is there any data on media trust and media credibility on the African continent? Maybe Aman, you could start by telling us, how do you communicate with your readers?
We communicate with our audience, especially with those subscribers, because we regularly exchange mails. So we even call to some of them on regular basis, a random call to some of our readers and viewers. We also collect information via email, telephone. They tell us our weaknesses, areas where we have to improve, and we also
Aman, are you with us? We are losing the connection with Aman there. That is something that happens quite often in internet conferences with Ethiopia. Maybe, Aman, you can try to reconnect again, or the connection improves and stabilizes. So let's hand over to Simon. How do you go about the communication with your readers, consumers?
So Christoph, when we were launching The Continent in April, we were looking into various ways of distributing this PDF publication via WhatsApp, and there are various, automated solutions where you can just batch send a whole bunch of messages at once, sort of like a bot that does it automatically, which is what I assumed that we would do. Then Kiri Rupiah, who manages our digital and distribution for The Continent, she said, no, this is the wrong way of doing it, because people don't want to communicate with a robot. They want to communicate with a human being. And so one of the things that we do is we distribute The Continent by hand. Obviously not by hand, by cell phone, but it's manual. It's one by one. We send it to each person who has subscribed. And what that has created, and this is what Kiri was sort of angling for, is a relationship between our subscribers and us, in that many of them feel absolutely comfortable responding to us on WhatsApp and having a conversation. And that has been quite wonderful in terms of the feedback that it has generated. One example that I can give is a couple of months ago, we published an article in Shona, a Zimbabwean language. And it was very well received, but a lot of people got in touch with us. A lot of our Zimbabwean readers got in touch with us and said, thanks for this article, but actually we speak Ndebele, and you weren't catering to us. So when is the Ndebele story coming? And it was just last week, actually, we were able to publish our first Ndebele story. That came directly from having an open channel to our audience, and then listening to them when they came to us with their concerns.
Very interesting. And I'm curious what you're going to do, Simon, when readers from Tanzania, which has about 200 ethnic groups, will ask you to publish the one or the other story, maybe in their languages, but maybe their one can refrain to the big lingua franca, which is Kiswahili, and which is being understood by everybody.
It's a question that we're really struggling with, because it's something that is very important to our identity as a Pan-African publication, is that we are committed to publishing in African languages. But there are major political decisions you are making when it comes to doing that. As I'm sure Aman would be able to confirm, if we want to publish in an Ethiopian language, say we want to cover the recent violence against or involving the Oromo community, and we want to publish that in Amharic, that is making a very political statement. If we want to publish in Nigeria, do we publish in Hausa, Igbo, or Yoruba? And what does that say about our political stance? So it's very complex. And it's an area that we are sort of navigating very slowly and carefully as we grow.
Welcome back, Aman. I'm glad that you were able to join us again. I wanted to continue by asking, when it comes to journalistic work, of course, journalists interact a lot with politicians, no matter whether they are from the opposition, whether they are from government, whether they're in exile, whether they are underground. But politics and politicians is like they are like companions of journalists. Do you see in your respective countries, in South Africa and in Ethiopia in this case, an appreciation or an acknowledgement of the public, of politics, no matter whether they are in government or whether they are in the opposition, of the necessity to have a press and to have a free press and to have a press that is able to sustain itself, even if this press is not always sympathetic towards one's own political goals? Simon, maybe we start with you. Simon has a problem with his microphone. Yes.
Sorry, Christoph, I lost you just at the end there. Would you mind repeating the last?
Yes, the question was, do you see acknowledgement in politics in your country, no matter which side they are on, that there is a necessity to have a free press and to protect this press and to sustain it, even if this press is not always sympathetic towards the ruling party, the opposition, you name it?
You know, I think that a couple of years ago, under President Jacob Zuma's administration, there were some major legislative attacks against the free press. The main one being what we called the Secrecy Bill, which was a law that would have made it highly illegal to whistleblow for anyone. It would have removed all protections from whistleblowers. And made it incredibly difficult for journalists to do their job of holding power to account. And it was a pretty bitter fight in the civil society space to fight against that law, but we were able to delay it until such a time as the government changed, and eventually that secrecy bill was shelved by the government. So I would say, as much as I'm not sure that there is buy-in from the political elite for a free media, I think they'd all be much happier if we would just shut up. In South Africa, at least, there is a very strong civil society who understands just how important a free media is, and is very alert to any attempts, any sort of obvious attempts to curtail the rights of a free media. Of course, I think the bigger threat in South Africa comes not from our political classes, actually, but more from the economic situation that many media houses find themselves in. And ultimately, not enough funds has pretty much the same impact in terms of throttling free speech as certain restrictive laws do.
Aman, how is journalism being appreciated or disrespected by politicians in your country, in Ethiopia?
To speak a little about the importance of buy-ins from political leaders for the media to operate in a very flourishing kind of environment is really very important, but that needs to have government which strongly believes in democracy and free speech here in Ethiopia, because our situation is really very different, and we have really very weak civil society organizations and very weak media houses, and that's precisely because of stifling government laws. And when the current Prime Minister came 2.5 years ago, that was supposed to change immediately, and very restrictive laws were also supposed to change immediately. There was an attempt, but it was a very incomplete attempt, and still we have laws that are stifling the private media. And in fact, we see an increasing monopolization of information that's really making the private media in a very precarious situation, because government has three major the federal government has three major news outlets, and the ruling political party has also two major medias, and they reach the large proportion of the audience. So government is trying to give the public, mainly through these state and party-owned medias, sidelining the private medias. So I believe there is a lot to work with the government to get a buy-in that every media, whether it is public or private, as long
Aman is frozen again, and hopefully be able to join us in a few moments from now. Simon, when we talk about credibility, and I try to touch on it in my introductory remarks, when we talk about credibility, we of course also have to talk about money. We have to talk about finances, because good journalism is costing money. Not that trash journalism is not costing any money, but good journalism really needs money. And when we look at investments that are being made in the media these days, I sometimes wonder, will it still be possible to actually do trustworthy journalism when advertising is drying up, and when maybe the role of donors, of foundations that give money to media enterprises is also going to change in the next couple of years, because they might turn to other topics and to other subjects? Simon.
To me, the economics of journalism are the single greatest threat to media freedom in South Africa and Africa more generally. Good journalism is expensive. It takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of behind the scenes work, and you can't really skimp on it. And I think, in South Africa, we've seen it over the last few years. While there is a healthy media, there's lots of outlets, there's lots of big investigations, if you look carefully, the scope of what is being covered in South African media is shrinking. The number of working journalists is shrinking. The geographical areas that they are able to access is shrinking. So yes, there's fantastic news coverage of Cape Town, Johannesburg, Pretoria, Durban. Outside of those major cities, suddenly things start looking very patchy. I often think the Marikana massacre, which was the horrific incident in 2012, where I think 34 miners were killed. It was one of the sort of biggest stains on post-democratic South Africa. And yet I often wonder, Marikana occurred an hour and a half or 2 hours outside of Johannesburg. It was an easy place for journalists to drive to it relatively inexpensively. If it had occurred in another province further away that required a flight, how many editors would have said, okay, get on that flight and find out what happened? I think there would have been very few, because there simply are not the funds. And that really represents an existential threat. I think the message for donors, because increasingly journalism in South Africa is becoming a donor-driven space. And the message for donors is that a free media is the cornerstone of all other work. The entire civil society kind of depends on having accurate and reliable news. Without it, there is nothing. And you need to ensure that journalism is healthy. And that means funding not specific projects, not, oh, I'm interested in health or community responses or education and funding that. It means funding core news reporting so that there can be a broad sort of base of news from which to work from.
Let us also look at the situation in Ethiopia, Aman, because you came up with these two publications at a time when all around in Africa, but I think also in Ethiopia, there was a lot of talk about the death of the media, about the decline in quality, about declining advertising revenues that you need in order to do good journalism. Has the development in the last few years since you started Addis Maleda in the Ethiopian Business Review given you hope that there is a possibility to finance good quality journalism?
I see. The issue is, of course, advertising revenue is declining, but there is a need to think outside the box and find alternative ways of financing good journalism. Increasingly, because of citizen journalism, which is enabling many young people with smartphones the ability to cover and report news, is depriving mainstream media's opportunity of providing verified information. So we have to do this alternative mechanism of diversifying revenue streams, and also we have to do this institutional building strategies to strengthen our financial base. So what we're doing is, in one hand, there has been it's very few medias that we have in this country, and they are not reaching out to the general public. So we should always look for to expand the market, to develop the market, and there is still opportunity. Challenging, yes, it is very challenging, but it's not a whole scenario where things are not possible to keep the business. So why we expanded into Amharic newspaper at Addis Maleda is because it will broaden our readership in one hand, and there is a dire need in the country for verified information. Addis Maleda newspaper has become a good source of verified information, and its digital presence is especially very encouraging. So if we do the institutional building in one hand by turning the company from an individual owned to a public company, to a shared company where many more shareholders will invest, will put some money as a shareholder, we will solve one thing, our financial problem. And on the other hand, we also have to think new and innovative approach of reaching out to the public and attracting advertisers. Because if you see the political environment, it's really very difficult in Ethiopia. The absence of very professionally run media house is very critical in Ethiopia, because otherwise we have more than 6.5 million people on social media, on Facebook, and these are being targeted by people with content rich in hate speech and religious, that calls for religious and ethnic clashes in the country. So I don't want that to happen to my country, and whatever means I have to contribute by providing verified information to the public and contributing to the democratization program in the country. So it's not only financial reasons that drives my commitment to free press and media. My commitment to democracy, that I want to see my country where democracy is the rules of the game, puts me with all the energy and commitment to build the institution, bring new shareholders to strengthen our financial capacity, and also look for alternative mechanisms of financing our activities.
There has been quite a bit of talk now, and you both mentioned it, about training and journalism schools. Simon Allison's father did not hire any graduates from journalism schools. I think that resonates very well with Amanyehun SiSAY in Addis, who also says, I'm not going to hire any people from journalism schools, but let us underline, there are very good journalism schools elsewhere in the world. It's not necessarily the fact that in Ethiopia or in parts of South Africa it might be like that journalism schools don't produce here and there good graduates. So we don't want to discourage people who are attending journalism schools and are watching us at the moment. But I think training is very essential when it comes to credibility and when it comes to quality. Unfortunately, we have observed many publishers in the last couple of years who have been subsequently cutting down on the budgets for training and also for hiring people. And the result has been, Amanyehun mentioned it earlier on, that we hardly find any gray-haired people in newsrooms anymore, but we find very young, very committed, very eager journalists, but not necessarily the gray-haired or the bald person who can say, well, 25 years ago, we did it this way and that way, and we acted like this with the authorities and so on and so forth. Is that a challenge, and what can be done against it? Aman and then Simon.
Yes, we have a challenge of graduates from journalism schools not being very ideal to work in our newsrooms. From my 14 years experience in the media, I find graduates of economics and law to be better journalists. So they have, they need to be trained for the writing skill, but they tend to be better to learn fast and adapt to the environment. Graduates of journalism school in my country, I know it's not in all other countries, but in my country, it is just the government's universities that train journalists. And because our government doesn't have commitment to democracy and free press, what it does is flood the industry with poorly educated journalists. So whoever you hire is very likely that they would be not a good journalist. This doesn't mean that all graduates from journalism schools are not good, but you need to train them very well to make them fit for the newsroom pressure. You need to invest a lot in them so that they report in a very well detailed, balanced, and objective way. I can give you an example of how a journalist graduating from these public universities could report. Suppose there is a workshop where industrialists are meeting the prime minister and telling their problems about investing in the manufacturing sector. The investors are listing problems they face on a daily basis, from power shortage to the foreign currency problem and the absence of peace and security that disrupts their activities. And there is this prime minister answering what his administration would do to solve these problems. So a journalist from these public schools is attending this event. When you listen to the news at night on the national broadcaster, you'd listen the answers the prime minister was giving, but not the list of problems the entrepreneurs or the business people were telling the prime minister to pay attention. This is a kind of problem that we have. So they're not very well equipped with the technical skill of investigating what happens and even reporting fairly without leaning to this or that kind of issues. So we've been disappointed. I've been disappointed personally for a number of times. But these days, and another challenge they have is the language, the English language problem is a very serious problem. When they write one thing, they have limitations to comprehend the issues. On the other hand, they have the English language limitations and the composition skills, which are very important altogether to produce a good content. So for the Addis Madadat Amharic, because the language is in local language, I see that we can hire graduates of journalism schools, but still we have to put a lot of energy. We have to train them very well. And when they learn and acquire basic skills, their confidence improves, they leave. So we have to bring other young people. It's very challenging.
Thanks, Aman. And how do you deal with that in South Africa, Simon?
So, I think one of the issues that we have is as newsrooms have got smaller, it becomes harder and harder to give younger journalists the opportunity to really learn their craft in the form of an internship or work experience, that kind of thing, because journalism, as we all know, is a hands-on profession. You need, no matter how good the journalism school is, and in South Africa we have some excellent journalism schools, you also need the hands-on experience inside a newsroom to really understand and learn on the job. Those opportunities are becoming fewer. It's really hard for us, even as the Mail and Guardian, to offer a substantial amount of internships, because that takes a lot of management, a lot of resources from our newsroom to manage those interns and to make sure they're okay and learning and producing good enough work. So that is a problem. More generally, Christoph, I think in terms of, keeping good journalists inside the profession, that really is the issue that I struggle with. I work with a lot of journalists across Southern Africa, for example, many really fantastic reporters, and several of them have expressed to me that their career path is they want to do journalism for several years. It's not very well paid, and it can be very dangerous in some of these countries. And then after they have made a name for themselves in journalism, they want to get a job working for an NGO, an international NGO in the comms department that will pay them 5 or 6 times what they are earning as a journalist. That is the plan. And that means that the best journalists are getting snapped up by comms departments in international organizations or businesses, etc. It makes it very hard to hang on to talent. And so we really have to be creating career opportunities that sort of trajectories where journalists can say, hey, if I'm good and I work hard, I know that I will be able to get a well-paying job. And those trajectories simply don't exist at the moment.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you, Aman. I think following our discussion this afternoon, one can say, discussing the building of trust and credibility in the media and in the media in Africa, that there's a lot of work ahead of us, but that the future is certainly not bleak. I thank you both, and I also thank those people who have asked a few questions in the Q&A box and in the chat box. And I'm sorry that we can't refer and can't answer all the questions, but I would like to conclude before I hand over to Barbara Triumphi, that impunity comes with values, which means that the culture of impunity amongst so many in the media has also to be challenged. And the International Press Institute and Cast Media Africa will continue to organize discussions and debates about the role that media should play and could play in Europe, in the US, and other parts of the world, not least here on the African continent. Thank you all for joining us, and let us keep on debating and look for ways to maintain and sustain, which is so important for a vibrant world. And over to you, Barbara.
Thank you very much. And also from IPI, thanks to Aman and Simon for this really powerful conversation. And thanks to you, Christoph, for an excellent moderation, but also thanks to Cast Africa for helping us make it possible. This was the last session of IPI's 2020 Online World Congress, which over the past 5 weeks brought to our audiences some of the global leaders in journalism, innovation, and press freedom indeed. If you have missed any of the session of the World Congress sessions, many of the videos are already available online, and I believe my colleague is sharing the link soon in the chat box. But we'll also bring to you podcasts and articles and lessons learned based on all this, because this Congress, as this session today, has been so rich, and we don't want to miss any of the lessons learned that our panelists have brought to us. IPI's global networks work in supporting independent media and help managing the digital transition will also continue indeed. And for all this, stay tuned with IPI Communications and stay safe. Thank you again to our panelists and to you, Christoph.